Hi team, and welcome back to the Carb-Appropriate podcast, where I talk to inspiring people in health, fitness, nutrition, business, and the creative arts who are doing interesting things to improve performance and maximize human potential. And today I am super excited to be talking to Dr. Lara Briden, the period revolutionary, a naturopathic physician, renowned expert on women's and hormonal health, and also one of our featured speakers at HPN 2018 this year. Welcome, Lara.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Hey, so we haven't actually met in person, so this is exciting to be talking. I obviously learnt initially about you from my team. I have a very great team over here, and they had spoken extremely highly of you and your work. And so I had looked a little bit into what you do, and we had talked about getting you down here up here, wherever you happen to be at the time.
You're north from where I am.
Yeah. I know you changed location a little bit. We talked about getting you here for the HPN conference even a couple of years ago. And so super excited to have you here this year. And I just wanted to thank you for the great work that you're doing as well. I've been thinking about this a lot with, the world situation as it is at the moment and a lot of the things that are going on. It's an interesting industry we're in because, especially in nutrition, where I'm, pretty firmly couched and have been for most of my career, it's dominated by women in terms of numbers, but it's still very patriarchal, I think. And a lot of the loudest voices and a lot of the, ideas and concepts that we have are very much couched in a male perspective. And so I think it's really important, the work you're doing. And I think it's really important for people like myself to be able to talk with you and get a better understanding of what's really going on, because I think often we just sort of become very set in our ways, I should say.
Yeah, I'm trying to flip the script and it's a thought experiment, present the idea that a woman is the standard normal version of a human being. And once we start to see it through that lens, that female physiology, women's hormones, women's periods are not a side issue, but a central part of human physiology, it changes the whole dynamic, changes the whole conversation.
Absolutely. And I guess that's something that happens, is beginning to happen a little bit more frequently now, is there is a lot more research going on into that area. But I guess traditionally, a lot of the populations that were studied were college age males. I mean, so much of our research is based on that.
Absolutely. This is not just within nutrition. This is all of medicine. Women have basically been left out of the conversation, left out of a lot of the thinking. And so a lot of, I think, what's being presented out there nutritionally is what works for men being presented as this can work for everybody. And that's what I'm trying to change.
Yeah, and we've had a few little Twitter discussions, which I'm going to get into in just a little bit as well.
Sure.
And I guess even within that, my perspective is going to be as a male working with not just males, working with males and females, but probably, you made a really good point that sometimes we don't ask the right questions, and that sort of tempers what we're seeing as well, because we haven't necessarily got the right data to work from. But I want to take a quick backtrack, because a lot of the people that are going to listen to this podcast going forward are probably big fans of you and your work anyway. So they're going to know a little bit about what you do.
Sure.
But for those that don't, how did you get started in health overall? And more importantly, how did you come to be doing what you're doing now as the period revolutionary? And I hope I don't use that term flippantly.
Oh, no, I'm happy to have that term out there. Actually, you know what, Cliff? I started as a scientist. So I was studying evolutionary biology back in the 80s, and I actually published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal on the sex differences of foraging behavior of a particular species of bat. So it's actually harking back to that now, thinking back to my days as a biologist, putting it through that lens. Yeah, from an evolutionary perspective, we have males and females have different criteria. So of course that was 25 years ago. And that it's only now that I'm kind of drawing on some of that. But after that, I went on to retrain as a naturopathic doctor at the college in Toronto. I started out in general practice in ranch country, south of Calgary, just small town, Alberta, very different sort of thing. And I just worked with everyone. back in the days when, probiotics were a weird idea. It's fun to have been practicing during that whole arc of change back to, the 90s when things were very different. And then when I moved to Sydney in the early 2000s, I just started working mainly with women. And so it's been the last, 15 years, I've done an essentially deep dive into what works for common period problems, perimenopause, things like that. And I just feel like that gave me the opportunity to learn a lot about women and women's bodies and what works. It's been great.
And so from an overview sort of perspective, what would you say people, and I'm talking here also about practitioners, what do you think they're mainly missing with respect to health overall, but more particularly women's health?
That women need to ovulate to be healthy. That's my talk at your event coming up is I think I called it, if you're not thinking about ovulation, you're not thinking about health. There are a number of obstacles to ovulation. And my experience is most doctors, most PTs, most everyone is not thinking about that. They might have some vague sense of, is she menstruating? But that's very different than is she ovulating, because of reasons we can go into.
So where do you think that disconnect is? Because I guess a lot of us, even relatively well educated and, doing a good job for our clients, would be asking the general questions about menstrual cycles and things. But where is that not going deep enough from your point of view?
Well, I kind of lay the blame at, honestly, I have to say, I kind of lay the blame at that hormonal birth control, because of the way we've shut down women's hormones for 60 years, the physiology associated with ovulation, the benefits we get from progesterone that we make from ovulation has just not been on the radar. It's just not seen as something valuable, which is kind of crazy, because if you make the analogy to testosterone for men, this would be like, for the last 60 years, us saying, look, men, you really don't need testosterone until you're ready for a baby. So we're going to give you this drug to turn it off. And don't worry, because everybody else is doing it, even though, it affects your mood and your libido and weight, metabolism, that's just what you've got to do to be a man. That's kind of the crazy thing we say to women. So I think that's part of the problem. I think it's that. I think it's just myopic view, like kind of tunnel vision, not sort of not thinking about women's physiology as part of the whole picture.
It's a fascinating discussion, because I watched an interesting documentary just a week or so ago, and it was about the sort of sexual revolution in the 60s and how the contraceptive pill was really quite a critical part of the social movement.
Yes.
But when we look at the physiology, it's a pretty interesting situation that it's really the only drug that comes to mind that I can think of, at least, that is not designed to treat a pathology. And it's so common and people just don't even think about it. There's no pathology it's treating. It's actually probably in some instance worsening some people's pathologies. Wouldn't you agree?
It's in every instance. It's castrating women. I mean, not to overstate it, but that's what it does. It shuts down the ovarian function.
It's going straight in the show notes,
Yeah. I mean, whereas it would be like shutting down testicular function. I mean, that sounds crazy. It'd be like shutting down testicular function, then giving back a substandard version of testosterone that's not as good and has other side effects. That's what we're doing. And yes, okay, in terms of, yes, I think it was important for women, but it was the way I see it, it was a stepping stone. That was 60 years ago. This is 2018. Like, we surely can come up with something better. And I have a couple of thoughts. I think if it was proposed today for the first time, most scientists, doctors would just be appalled that that's what we were proposing to do. And also, I'm pretty convinced that future generations will look back and think, what was that about? Why did we feel like that was the only way we could not only prevent pregnancy, but somehow the idea that it manages women's health? I mean, it suppresses symptoms, but at a big cost. Women are paying a cost. I'm obviously very passionate about this. I'm drawing on my work from 20 years with patients, and just seeing in real life stories what this means for women. On my Instagram feed, I have a little series of what I call coming off the pill stories. There'll be things like that. These are actually literally jot down in my consults with patients, write down in their own words what they say the one that started it all off for me was a young woman who said when she stopped the pill after, 15 years, it was like a curse was lifted.
Wow.
Yeah. That's what women experience in the shift in their mood, their energy. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I haven't got the same experience there that you have, but it was interesting in my early days of practice, the drug cascade side of things, and it was particularly with skin health.
Yeah.
Someone suffering poor skin health, and so they're either told to go on the pill or on pretty high dose antibiotics. And then in some instances, there were these poor people who were basically then starting to take more and more medication to treat the effects of the medications they were taking for something that in the base instance was actually fairly innocuous. Now, I'm certainly not understating the importance of, skin health, and particularly, skin health socially, because it can be such a stigmatizing thing. But what was super interesting was getting those people off the meds and looking at a proper plan of sort of holistic intervention at the baseline, cleared up the skin issues without the drug cascade. And that was really eye-opening for me as a young practitioner back in the sort of, I guess, similar sort of time, late 90s kind of thing. Exactly.
There's a cascade that happens with the pill. That's actually the first. I have little patient stories in my book, and that's one of the first ones. Is she really common? Start the pill when you're 15 for skin, 14, 15. Within 12 months, depression, and on an antidepressant. And then that's all happening at 15. And of course, at that age, you don't have enough wherewithal to really think, wait, was that first steroid drug that I took maybe affecting my mood? And then, a year later, you're on antidepressants, and that's just how you stay for 10 years. Yeah. And I mean, we know the link with depression is real. That there was a study out of Denmark in end of 2016 that tracked 1.1 million women and found a conclusive link between all types of hormonal birth control and increased incidence of depression and anxiety diagnoses. And the researchers said that's an underestimation, because those are just women who were diagnosed and given antidepressants. That doesn't even include all the women who just quietly said, no way, I'm not taking this.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yep.
And again, it's something I was expecting to be, somewhat wowed by some of the things you said, but the interesting thing, this is so simple, right? This seems to be such simple stuff, and yet because it's so formulaic and it's so foundational in women's healthcare that they're provided with these medications, that we just forget about those effects. You know what?
You just said the word simple is my mission statement. I did an interview last week, and she's like, well, I guess we have to acknowledge that women's health is quite complicated. And I was like, no, no, it's not. Women's health, I want to dispel that myth, because that's the narrative we've been told, is that women's health is in the too hard basket. It's mysterious. It's complicated. It's in the domain of gynecologists. It's like, no, periods are an extension of our general health. They are both an indicator and a creator of our general health. They are not that complicated. And the reviews I love on Amazon of my book are things like, why did no one ever explain this before? It's really it's not that complicated. What you eat, what you do affects your periods. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, I was laughing when you mentioned that, because this is going back a long time now. This is probably about the year 2000, I'd say. Yeah. I had a brief moment of notoriety here in New Zealand as the menopause guy, and it's not something I tried to do. Yeah, I didn't, want that moniker at all. But what happened was I was sent a number of clients who were really struggling with perimenopausal issues. Yep. Now, typically, and since then, I would typically send them on to one of my female colleagues who specializes in that, because it's not within my wheelhouse. But at the time, there wasn't really anyone that I trusted to do a good job, because it was in the depths of the very high carb, extremely low fat mania. And I thought that was one of the issues there. Yep. And so I wasn't, and I still am not, a women's health expert, but what I did was basically just provided a very basic lifestyle plan that included eating natural unprocessed food. And it certainly wasn't carb restricted. It was natural unprocessed food first and foremost, and it included sufficient amounts of fat. Yeah. It was almost that simple.
And protein, probably upping their protein. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So good levels of protein, lots of vegetables, healthy fats, and then ad libitum on top of that, whatever healthy carbs they could eat on, basically on top of that foundation, which is typically sort of my carb-appropriate approach. And these people got just phenomenal results. And so they started telling all their friends. And so I had all these perimenopausal women coming in to see me. Yeah. And at the time I was a young, guy competing in weightlifting for New Zealand with a big mohawk and all this kind of stuff. The opposite. But the thing that rang true what we were saying there, it was simple stuff. It wasn't complex. It was basically providing the building blocks, and people got results.
Yeah, I could totally imagine that, actually, because perimenopause, some of those symptoms do respond really well. Just get the alcohol out, get the protein up in the morning. The body responds. It's not complicated.
So what's the sort of, what are some of the steps that you go through then if someone, is really committed, as a lot of people are, or not just committed, but very scared about going off the contraceptive pill? I mean, how do you approach that from a practitioner's point of view?
Well, first step is to decide why they're on it. Do they need something reliable, alternative contraception? So we look at that. Are they worried about their skin? That's probably the most common one, in which case I have a how to prevent and treat post-pill acne kind of protocol. I usually get them started about a month before. It's zinc, cut the dairy, cut the sugar for a month before, and in the context of a healthy diet. And usually they're happily surprised. I mean, these might be women who previously tried to stop the pill and then found out they got the horrible post-pill acne, which I'll just say for your listeners, starts at about 3 to 6 months off the pill. It doesn't start straight away. They come off, they think, oh, maybe I'm okay. And then boom, 3 months in, they get this explosion of breakouts. And that is very distressing. And that's about when at the 6-month mark, they go back on, and they might've been just about to turn the corner and get better anyway. That's an example of a post-pill situation. There's other situations, they might be worried they're not going to get their period, which then has a different flow chart I go through to work out why they maybe weren't getting their period last time they stopped the pill. Then there's endometriosis, which I'll just mention briefly because it always gets brought up. As soon as I bring up the idea of stopping hormonal birth control, people say, well, I need it for my endometriosis, which is a painful condition. Yeah. That's, in a way, that's a whole other podcast on its own. Endometriosis is a very serious condition, and I think natural treatments can help, but sometimes hormonal birth control is required for symptom suppression, and that's fine. But 9 out of 10 women don't have endometriosis. So for all the other women who don't have that inflammatory disease, I would say pretty confidently that most of them can have reached the place of having natural cycles that just arrive with no PMS or pain or fanfare, or really just a regular normal period. That's what the body can do in most cases. Yeah.
And I again, this is just from my experience, but I've found that in the presence of those, endometriosis is a very inflammatory condition. In the presence of those types of conditions, often people aren't, because they haven't been advised to, they're not taking care of the foundational stuff underneath the medications, so they haven't really looked extensively at diet, because obviously doctors aren't trained to prescribe that. They haven't looked at holistic, lifestyle interventions and things. And so often when you take care of that underlying stuff, even if the need for a medication isn't completely abated, it's kind of reduced a lot, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, actually, because you're a scientist, I will share with you a little scientific insight into endometriosis, potentially out of interest. I actually just had a meeting with a scientist from the UNSW Microbiome Institute. She was contacting me because of some of the stuff I've written about endometriosis. She is going to be doing a study on looking at the role of the pelvic microbiome and potentially gram-negative bacteria in the pelvis as a major driving factor of endometriosis, both in terms of finding a biomarker, potential treatments. She told me off the record, endometriosis behaves like a microbial disease, which is pretty fascinating. So we treat it as mainstream medicine treats it as a hormonal condition. It's not. It's actually an inflammatory, potentially microbe-driven, or at least influenced immune disease, and it's affected by hormones. So we have this blunt instrument where we shut down hormones to try to control the disease. It doesn't actually even work that well for most women, if hormonal birth control, but it can sometimes suppress symptoms, but it doesn't treat the disease.
Yeah. And I mean, that makes sense, you know, whether, you know, what comes out of that will be super interesting. But,
yeah.
you know, I find it so fascinating. I am probably characterized as a metabolic kind of guy, right? When you study carb tolerance and you study ketogenic diets and things like that, you're based around metabolism.
Yes.
And you go to those types of conferences and everyone's talking about basically metabolic state. It's all about cardiometabolic state. That's the important stuff.
Yes.
Then you go to a microbiome conference and everyone's talking about the gut bacteria, and that's all that's important.
Right.
And I think most of us, as, you know, naturopathic trained scientists, would sit back and say, well, it's the whole lot, really.
There's often more than one factor going on. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, and so you and I have had a little discussion online about the role of starch. And I think that would be obviously super interesting for our listeners. So what's your opinion first up on keto for women in general?
Well, so I'm not an expert on ketogenic diets. I don't prescribe it for my own patient population, but I'm not against it. So just in a broader sense, I would certainly acknowledge, as a clinician, you know, I acknowledge that ketogenic diets can be therapeutic for obviously certain neurological conditions. I believe that, yeah, I mean, I don't doubt for a second that in cases of more severe insulin resistance, that at least a temporary ketogenic diet would be therapeutic for potentially reversing that. I'll often, with my very insulin resistant patients, I will take them lowish carb, maybe not all the way to ketogenic, but I definitely put the emphasis on low carb. So just to set the stage, I'm on board with a low carb. In fact, you know, I've been practicing 20, 25 years. I was taking people off bread and sugar and kind of low carb leaning back in the 90s. And I was never, ever, like for a second, on board with low fat. So for me, I have a long history of recognizing that too much carbohydrate in the wrong person is metabolically damaging. So from that perspective, we're on the same page. I suspect we're on the same page for almost all of this. I think what's different is that my observation, which seems to be confirmed by a number of other clinicians. So I'm putting an invitation out there for people to observe this, is that in young women, I'll say by young, I mean, you know, of reproductive age. So let's say younger than 40. I mean, I'm older than 40 technically we're still reproductive age, but there's different things start to happen in our 40s. I think you mentioned perimenopause, insulin resistance becomes more of a problem. So let's talk about younger women. Especially if they do not have insulin resistance, they are in a different metabolic situation, and they are potentially can lose their period from going to low carb. By lose their period, I mean lose their ovulation. So the first step, as any clinicians out there, you know, personal trainers, is to understand, to know how to ask about ovulation. So first of all, to know that a pill bleed is not a period. So if your client or patient is on hormonal birth control, straight away there's no conversation to be had about ovulation. You don't know. They're castrated anyway. So you're not getting that piece of information from them. So are they having natural cycles? Is their natural cycle coming within, let's say, every 35 days? And is it an ovulatory cycle? And by that, they can track temperatures, they can look for fertile mucus, women can know that they're ovulating. And my view is if a woman is managing to ovulate regularly, she's doing pretty good with her diet. What happens with restricted diets, whether it's too low carb or just too low calorie or too low fat or there's lots of ways to lose ovulation. It doesn't happen straight away. There's usually 3 to 4 months, little honeymoon period when the periods are still going. That's fine. After the 4 to 5 to 6 month mark, ovulation can stop. And is it true? I mean, I'm just curious, Cliff, are you not seeing that with your young women patients? I mean, are you?
I'm not.
No.
And I think, I'm not saying that it doesn't occur, because I think, you know, my approach, you know, I've even created this term back in the late 90s, carb-appropriate, because
Yes.
I didn't agree that there was one size fits all.
Exactly.
And even keto, people get keto wrong because, a lot of what we see is still couched in the old classic 4 or 5 to 1 protocols that were given to kids with epilepsy back in the mid 20th century.
Right.
And for most people, that type of keto diet, even if it's calorie sufficient, I think is not going to be an exemplary diet because it cuts out so much micronutrient content typically through not having vegetables. It doesn't necessarily, maybe it does, but it probably doesn't support the microbiome as well as a well-balanced keto diet. And typically they are very low in protein. And even people who are now doing better keto diets, I think, are often still drastically underdoing the protein because they're so scared of gluconeogenesis.
Yeah.
So I think that there's probably a big middle ground there where people are getting really, and I don't want to be the guy who's saying, oh, well, everyone who's experiencing these things is getting, on a shitty keto diet, because that might not be true. But I think some of them at least are. And I think there's also a potential challenge as well, where some people on a keto diet end up under eating without realizing it. Now, that in itself is potentially problematic because, we would know not just with women, but I spoke about this with Dr. Dan Plews, one of my good buddies, who's a researcher up at AUT as well. And even a very small reduction in calories will basically affect hormonal balance in anyone, man or woman, and it only needs to be about 300 to 400 calories per day over a long enough period. And so that's why I have been quite vocal about the idea that in a lot of cases, it's a reduction in fuel availability, not necessarily the carb content. And the reason why I've stated that so vocally in a lot of different forums is because I know of women who have had fantastic results from being lower carb, and they've been scared into having arbitrarily high amounts of carb because apparently it's going to help their hormonal function. And some of the numbers that have been thrown around, I remember one of my students came in and said, oh, someone's told me I need to eat a minimum of 250 grams of carbs per day in order to preserve hormonal function. I said, that's crazy. That makes no sense.
I agree that that's an arbitrary amount. I think you just made a couple of good points. So first of all, I do think protein is important. We're definitely on the same page there. And as just from my biology background, makes sense. Protein is the key nutrient, the key appetite. So that is important to make sure that's in place. And also a lower carb diet, higher protein diet is just a natural appetite suppressant. So potentially, yes, women do run into the risk of unintentionally under eating, which is something I see a lot for lots of reasons. Actually, digestive problems are another reason that women unintentionally undereat. So there needs to be an emphasis on finding a way for them to fuel or eat as much as they need. And also there clearly is individuality. So I would never make a blanket statement about what every woman needs. I do routinely test for insulin resistance. So, and keeping in mind, insulin resistance is a reversible state. So even if someone is insulin resistant at some point, they reverse out of that, they need to then change their diet. So if someone's insulin resistant, then potentially they're going to benefit from.
How do you test for that? How do you test for insulin resistance?
Well, the test I use, I'm curious to get your feedback about it. I use the glucose tolerance test with insulin. So it's the dynamic insulin. You take a fasting glucose plus insulin, then take the glucose drink, then test it at 1 and 2 hours. And then I look at the kind of area under the curve of insulin.
Cool. So you're almost a modified sort of Kraft protocol.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term actually, but is the Kraft protocol? Yeah.
Dr. Kraft, he did a lot of really interesting research, and it's recently been reanalyzed by one of my colleagues, Catherine Crofts. We've just co-authored a paper.
Okay.
And he basically took that, but I think he had a 4-hour.
Right.
So it was an OGTT and then a 4-hour, and he looked at different response curves basically, and he found a number of different subsets, which was super interesting.
Yeah.
And that's helped pave the way now for some of this emerging stuff around not just pre-diabetes, but what we're calling pre-diabetes, and then this idea of pre-diabetes,
right,
which is all sort of precursory stuff. And it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. It makes sense. So, right. So he's talking about the shape, the area under the curve of insulin itself over the 3 or 4 hours.
Yes.
Is that, that's similar to what I've been using.
Yeah.
So we're not guessing, right? I don't want to just have to say, well, I think you're insulin resistant, but I'm not sure. So it gives us some kind of baseline. And then, I watch, okay, here's the other thing I do. So for women in particular, I measure and watch the hormone LH. So this is something your clinician, as it needs to be kind of on around day 2 or 3 of the cycle, because LH naturally spikes in the middle of the cycle. So you don't want to accidentally measure it then and get confused. But at its baseline, as a very general overgeneralization, but I'll just say oversimplification, LH is low, too low when there's undereating or potentially undereating carbs. I mean, and in my interpretation, and it's too high in the insulin resistant, potentially kind of over carb state. So this is to do with what's called LH pulsatility from the pituitary related to the hypothalamus signaling. And it's hugely important for ovulation. Basically, this is women's ovulation and women's hormones. It all comes down to that. It's all about energy. A lot of it's about energy and other signals in the hypothalamus and then being expressed as LH pulsatility. LH pulsatility is too high in PCOS, for example. That's the polycystic ovarian syndrome, insulin resistant picture, too low in undereating. And now in terms of why, if we could determine that for some women, too low, not enough, inadequate glucose starch, inadequate starch, slows down the LH pulsatility. If that's happening, I think it's that direct signal of fed versus unfed to the hypothalamus. You see all kinds of different theories. It's always because of stress hormones. It's because of thyroid. It's because of all these, nebulous networks of effects. I actually think there's a pretty direct effect of food on hypothalamus, on pituitary, on LH signaling for women. And I think that needs to be researched. I mean, of course it needs to be researched. I don't want my just observation of this to be, obviously it can't be the final word. Like I would really love for someone to, on some kind of trial, observe this in women who are not insulin resistant going into it. So that would be the caveat.
We could throw around some ideas. I'm sure that's something we could look at. I mean, that would be fascinating. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, something that is, I think, missing from a lot of the conversation. And again, I'm stepping back and looking at this in a more general sense.
Yeah.
But I think total fuel availability is such a critical component of health overall, and it is often missed. And it's missed because I think people have moved away a lot from calories in, calories out, which is probably a good thing in some respects.
Yeah.
But they then forget about the role of fuel in the body, total fuel availability, and how that fuel is not just ingested, but created within the body, how we compensate, how that basically affects everything. And I think there's a lot going on there that people aren't necessarily recognizing. An example of that is, I'm relatively well known in the keto community, and I'm surprised by the way that people chase ketones.
Right.
You need to be on a stricter and stricter and stricter keto diet because you want your ketones to be higher and higher and higher.
Right.
And what I often say to people in workshops and lectures and things is, would you do the same for glucose?
Right.
Of course you wouldn't. Crazy. There's no way you'd be chasing like 12 millimoles of glucose. So why are people chasing 8 millimoles of ketones?
Right. This idea that more is better. So, I mean, the other way to think about energy is a signal as well as just a fuel, right? It's a signal to the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus has glucose sensing neurons, which I just was reading last night, actually, also respond to ketones. So it gets even more complicated. But clearly, in a very evolutionary sense, the hypothalamus it needs to know if there is enough food to make a baby. And it needs to know that. It's a life or death decision. It can't afford to have a pregnancy that will fail because, pregnancies can fail, but that's very stressful for the body, fail because of starvation. So it needs to make that decision. And it makes sense to me that depending on the ancestry of the woman, that hypothalamus and those glucose sensing neurons, might be more calibrated to potentially more glucose, more insulin signaling coming in compared to other populations. So I mean, that just makes sense because some people didn't have much carbohydrate, but some people did for tens of thousands of years, and that, you know, they're calibrated differently.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And I think that's also an interesting point as to why we can't necessarily look at the, you know, the hypothalamic responses of laboratory animals, because they're really poor low carb responders. You know, mice are terrible for keto studies. You know, we see all these silly studies come out saying this and that, and they're just terrible keto subjects because they don't go into ketosis very easily. I mean, it's very difficult to get a mouse into keto, just as it is most lab animals that we work with, whereas humans have a very good ability to do that. But I completely agree with you that some people just don't do that well on keto. Now, I think if someone does thrive on keto, I would suggest that there's not going to be any problem with their hormonal balance if they're eating enough calories and they're in ketosis. However, you know, I think one thing that I think is clear is when there are people who are staunch zealots on either end and they're not prepared to look at the option as a practitioner, that a change towards, let's say, higher carb could be beneficial for that person, they're really not doing the best job. And there's no way, like in practice, there's no way that I would do that. If someone's not responding well to keto, not that I'd have everyone on keto anyway, but if they weren't responding well to it, of course I would try them on higher carbs.
Yeah, just to clarify that, there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between how a woman feels and how her ovulation signaling is going. So I have certainly seen with my patients where they may actually be doing okay, like feeling okay in terms of energy. They might not be. I mean, they might be losing hair and having not sleeping and stuff like that. But
it's not so good.
Yeah, it's possible they are still functioning, but their ovulations have shut down. And that could be, I mean, they could have been ancestors of a population who they could keep going, migrating over a mountain range or something in ketosis because they're party people, but that is not a time to make a baby. And, I guess then the question is, well, if our ancestors could, lose their periods all the time because of starvation, then maybe we should too. I think that's not acceptable. I mean, the research is now that women, we do benefit from our own ovulations, making the hormones that you can only make with ovulation. So we're not trying to mimic the state of our half-starved ancestors either. That's not necessarily good for women.
It's more that we can do things, not that we should necessarily do them. I think you make a good point there, because I've been fairly vocal, within the keto community, it's saying that there are no populations on the planet, none, that are habitually ketogenic.
No. That's
a fact, right? There are, most populations at times would have been in ketosis. Because it's just a normal, and I don't even like the idea that it's sort of a starvation type adaptation. It's more so that it's just an adaptation that we have. And I think it's very beneficial at times. But you made a good point earlier on, something that I've actually discussed a lot with my colleague Eric Helms, who I think is just one of the best researchers on the planet. And we've posited the idea that a lot of people who really benefit from a very low carb diet, for the reasons that you suggested, like they're insulin resistant, hyperlipidemic, all that kind of stuff, it's not like that's a fixed state. So they will improve their insulin sensitivity, they'll become metabolically more functional, at which point we would have to say that if they came to us as a snapshot at that time, we wouldn't necessarily suggest a very low carb ketogenic diet.
Yeah, exactly.
So there can be fluidity there.
Yeah, it's no doubt it's therapeutic in certain situations. I think everyone has to acknowledge that. And and some people can use it strategically, sometimes to boost perform, or whatever they're doing with it. I'm not opposed to that, but I guess for women, I'm very concerned if they lose their periods. The other thing I'll share with you, just because my patient population is very mainstream. I mean, most of my patients aren't athletes or high performance kind of people. They are normal people struggling. They're trying to, ingest this information, often very different ideas that are out there. And for what it's worth, a lot of the people I talk to are very confused about carbohydrates. And I'll have patients who are they will strictly avoid potatoes and rice, but then binge on dates and agave syrup and desserts later. And this is happening. Like it's funny, but it's also really sad. So I'm in the camp where I actually think that high dose fructose is in its own category of being metabolically damaging. And from the perspective, I don't know if you saw this new research, but where this research paper where it was on an animal study, but they concluded that it was to do with the microbiome, that they said normally, so in the normal state, the small intestine is supposed to metabolize all the fructose, all of it that comes in, and it converts it to glucose or organic acids. It sort of deals with it. But if you overload that mechanism in the small intestine, then fructose spills into both the microbiome, where it was never supposed to go, and the liver, where this scientist is arguing it was never supposed to go. He said that the small intestine shields the liver from the toxic effects of fructose, which was really interesting. And he was then talking about how, when high dose fructose hits the liver, that's when bad things happen, right? Like oxidative stress, mitochondrial damage, things that induce insulin resistance. So that from a clinician point of view, that really makes sense. Like, I get the best results when my patients will seriously stop the soft drinks, the fruit juice, I'm dealing with people who they have insulin resistance, but they're guzzling Boost juice and things like that. Like, so my approach to low carb is, can you first please stop all the sugar? If you need to eat a little bit of potato with dinner to feel satisfied and, not crash, then that's okay, but we can deal with that later, but let's get there first. So
absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen or read one of my books, The Carb-Appropriate Diet, but basically that encapsulates my philosophy of nutrition, which is you don't look at anything else until you've started with a diet that is based around natural unprocessed food.
Yeah.
And for, let's say, 80% of people, that's enough. Like, if you're looking at your plate and it's 80% natural unprocessed food, you're probably going to be okay.
Yep.
Particularly over the long term. And then we start to look at the nuances within that 20%, basically. And that's where we start to see, well, maybe this person's better off on a keto diet. Maybe this person's better off on modified low carb. Maybe this person's better off, one of the outliers who's really great on a very high carb diet. I mean, it happens. It happens.
And also the true sugar consumers are not, I hate to say it, but they lie about it. I mean, that sounds mean. They're addicted, right? They don't want to talk about it. They don't necessarily tell you in the first appointment that they're binging on half a bag of chocolate bars. Like, that's not going to come out in the conversation. So,
and we all do that with our vices. How many games of cards did you play last night? Oh, a couple.
Yeah.
What did you have last night? A couple.
Yeah, exactly. So I look at their ALT, I look at triglycerides, I'm looking at, the insulin, either fasting insulin or the whole kind of insulin, dynamic insulin testing that I talked about. And I can see the pictures. Like, I know this person is having sugar. Yeah. It's right there in black and white. And so then it's more of a conversation of, over a few appointments, it's like, you're not going to shock me. You can tell me you're not a bad person because you're eating sugar. Like, I've seen it before. Believe me. Yeah.
I think triglycerides are still underappreciated as one of the absolute. If I had to pick out of a blood panel, if I could only pick one thing, it would be triglycerides every day.
Yeah.
Because that is the most indicative proxy for cardiometabolic risk, for all-cause mortality risk, for insulin resistance. I mean, we can use it as a pretty good marker for insulin resistance. And we've got a paper coming out in about a month, which has presents a pretty strong hypothesis that triglycerides can basically predict what type of diet you should be on.
Yeah. Well,
so what we found, which was super interesting, was that those with really good, or the lowest triglyceride people actually did better on a higher carb diet.
Interesting.
Not just in terms of not, changing their risk or whatever. They had improvements only when they were on the slightly higher carb.
Yep.
They were all low carb interventions, but those who had the worst triglycerides at baseline basically needed to be on the very low carb diet. So we're going to have to do some more study to sort of add a bit more data to that. But at least we've got this indicative stuff, which I've thought for quite a long time, that trigs can really predict what type of diet someone should be on.
I like it. I mean, I'll just say that aligns with what I see. I mean, what I've been doing for years with, simple blood tests too, because everybody's got a triglyceride test, right? So it's right there. You can look at it. It's straight away. I'm thinking, okay, we're dealing with.
And that's critical, because it's something that everyone can get done. It's funded, it's subsidized, and you know, I teach that to my students all the time, is before you go and look at all the very expensive esoteric testing, learn how to read a blood panel well, because that's going to give you the best information, probably because it's validated, it's credible, and it's not going to cause further burden on the person's wallet. You know, one thing that I've become so concerned with in the last couple of years and that I'm really trying to work with is that so many of our clients, like you and I, so many of our clients would be the worried well who have money. And there's a lot of people out there who aren't getting the support they need because they just simply can't afford it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So both things you said. I mean, I think the worried well, I'm with you. I don't like them to be spending a lot of money on tests that they don't need. Microbiome testing that doesn't mean anything, you know, extra functional testing, when, as you say, you can get some really good information just from some basic blood tests. And yeah, I'm for the people, like that democratic, you know, I think these, well, that's a lot of my work, a lot of my communication, a lot of my writing is for everyone, that these, you know, these are just working with their own doctor with some basic testing, with some sometimes basic supplements. They can do a lot and it's within reach. I agree. Yeah.
So what are some of the sort of go-to books or resources in the health space that are your go-tos?
Yeah, my go-tos to read. That's a very, I mean, I mostly just read kind of papers, actually, scientific papers.
You're like me, boring person.
I mean, I've got just various ways of, you know, sorting them on my computer in folders of papers. So in terms of other books, that's a very good question. I haven't read a health book in a while, but yeah, I just follow, you know, Twitter, I guess, is where I get a lot of my health information as well, and follow, you know, articles and papers that people link to, like that article about fructose, the recent one about the link of the microbiome and bacteria for endometriosis. You know, that's not in any kind of book at this stage.
So you repost a lot of that stuff, right? So people should follow you on Twitter. And
actually, those things are in my book. I know you weren't asking for my book, but I mean, there's that as well.
No, we'll definitely link to your book in the show notes, and I highly recommend that people read that.
And I am going to read yours too. I'm intrigued now after such a great conversation today.
Well, I think it's when people read my book, they realize that I really hate being characterized as a keto guy, because although I was one of the first, I think, practitioners in Australasia to really start delving into keto, it wasn't because I thought it was for everybody. It's because I thought it was so valuable for some people. And for the rest, there's this spectrum there. And as you know, you and I discussed, it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that people are eating real food, and they're eating enough protein, and they're eating enough vegetables and things like that. I mean, and that's where conceptually, I think people can understand that too.
Yep.
When you sit down and talk with people and say, hey, you kind of know what real food is, right? Yeah. Well, don't stress about the rest just yet. Just get back in touch with eating food.
People are very confused. They are, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I think if enough of us stick with some clear, simple information, hopefully because what happens is when they're confused, they just give up, right? They're like, I tried keto, and then whatever reason it failed. And so then they're like, nothing will work. So then they're like, nothing will work. So I'm going to eat all this crap. That's how I'm going to exist. It's like, whoa,
And that's one of the reasons why I'm not opposed to, you know, when done well, I'm not opposed to a vegan diet. I'm not opposed to a keto diet. I'm not opposed to a very high carb whole foods diet, whatever it happens to be, if it works for that person.
I'm opposed to a keto. I'm opposed to a vegan diet. Sorry.
I'm probably on the same page as you.
Yeah.
I am not opposed to a vegan diet if the person is supplementing with B12, and if it is, you know, if they're really thriving on it. But I think that it's very problematic, and I think it's very interesting that you know, we recently had our government mandated review of diet types. And of course, it was the same old thing. The DASH diet comes out on top, followed by the Mediterranean diet. Low carb, you shouldn't do. But interestingly, there was no comment on a vegan diet.
Yeah.
And the criticisms of, I mean, leave aside low carb, but the criticism of paleo I thought was really interesting, because they basically said, don't do paleo. It restricts certain food groups, therefore it's bad. And I wrote to the authors, on Twitter, as you do.
Yeah.
And said, hold on, how can you say that one diet's bad because it restricts food groups, and you're not making comment about a vegan diet. That makes no sense to me. Whether or not it's good or bad, you can't use that as a metric.
Yeah, the vegan, I'll just say, as a biologist, this is through the lens of a biologist, a vegan diet is not a diet for humans. I mean, with my own patients, my view is, they could do it. I try to be supportive and not mean about it. But I say, but in my view, we're going to have to reduce our expectations of your health. Like you can only be so healthy on a vegan diet. There's a ceiling on that. It's not just B12, it's zinc, it's taurine, it's choline, it's iodine, it's vitamin A. It's yeah. I don't know how many vegan listeners you have, but I've just offended them all. But
I've probably got quite a few, and I offend them as well, because I make the same arguments. Even your your omega-3 metabolites, DHA, EPA, DPA. I mean, some people have an extraordinary challenge converting alpha-linolenic acid to those metabolites. And so it's well known that a lot of vegans are functionally deficient in essential fatty acids.
Yep. And they can't make vitamin A from beta carotene.
Exactly. I mean, there's a 13-fold difference in conversion rates between individuals.
Exactly. And
crazy.
They need taurine for the brain, for the nervous system, for So
that's good. I'm glad we've offended the vegans.
I know. Well, we've done that tick. No, I feel bad, but I don't know what else to do. I mean, for years I was trying to sort of say, well, it's okay if it's done properly. And now I'm just like, I have to be honest. I sort of feel like, I don't know, the analogy I always use is people can say, well, I'm going to sleep less for ethical reasons or whatever their reason is. Like my philosophy is I'm going to sleep less, or I'm going to breathe less oxygen, or this is, what I want to do, and don't criticize me for it. It's like, well, you can do that. I guess I can't stop you, but there's a biological reality of what's going to happen to your body when you do that.
Exactly. I say exactly the same thing. I say, if you want to be vegan for ethical or other reasons, then I may dispute those reasons as well, but I'm completely supportive of you for that. But there's no good reason to be vegetarian or vegan for health. No.
I agree.
In fact, I think it makes it more difficult, because you've just got to have so many other, I mean, the reality is you can have a good omnivorous diet, which is what we've evolved to eat, without supplementation, although I'm a fan of supplementation. But you can't say the same for a vegan diet. You absolutely need to supplement. It's absolutely essential.
Yeah. We'll move on now, because now that we've upset I feel bad. But I know
it's fine. It's fine, because it creates a good debate and people understand that we're pragmatic.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to say that it's from my biologist perspective. I mean, that's how I'm seeing it. Not even it's not a philosophy, right? It's just a biological reality. So.
And I'm the co-founder of a plant-based nutrition company.
Oh, right. Okay.
But I'm not vegan, and very few people at the company are either.
Right.
But yeah, we just choose to make them vegan so that we've got a bigger market. I probably shouldn't say that either.
Okay.
Anyway. I'd love to know just some of your, in the time that we have left, some of your keys to staying balanced. Like I understand that you're probably pretty busy, like a lot of the other influential people that I know in this industry. How do you manage to stay balanced and sort of, walk the talk that you're putting out there?
Yeah, I'm constantly having to make new boundaries around social media. That's been one of my challenges. I've been doing some of my own social media until recently. Now I've got someone to help me to go in and look at notifications and things. I find that personally very stressful. I don't know if everyone is as stressed out by social media as me, but it's something, it's feeding into our need as humans to be constantly validated. So it's this kind of dopamine hit. Plus for me, this constant fear of, is someone saying something bad about me on Twitter? It's like, I need to disassociate from that somehow.
It's destructive.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to butt in, but one of my very close friends emailed me yesterday and is having some challenges. And I'm not sure if you know, but I have bipolar disorder. So a lot of people ask my sort of advice on various things when they're struggling.
Yeah.
And one of the pieces of advice, I gave the person a couple of different pieces of advice, but one of them was to delete Facebook off your phone.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I have found to be so critically freeing in the last little while, because it's too easy just to flick in and get wound up with meaningless debates and things like that. And I time block, right? So I have very clear times for doing things. Like my communications, I do twice a day at about 11 or 4, and that includes everything. From email through to jumping on Twitter and having a quick debate with you, through to jumping on Facebook and whatever. And sorry, I'm going to cough you. That makes things so much more succinct, but it also cuts out the crap, because you don't want to be overly engaged in things that's not worth your time. And what I've found is that in not having that device to go back to and just have it as a proxy for doing something like a distraction, I've read 54 novels this year so far. I've got back into playing music. I'm training more, which I'd let slide the last couple of years. And just all these things, I've got a list on my wall in front of me in my office of the things that I love to do. And I wasn't doing them because I was just scrolling social media. Now I'm back doing the things I love.
It's a big deal. Like, it sounds funny and it sounds kind of trivial, but it's a big deal. It's been affecting all of our brains. Like, I actually feel it's been changing my brain. It has shorter attention span. I mean, the example is novels. You mentioned about novels. I've always been an avid reader. Love big, thick, juicy novels all my life. And the last 3 or 4 years, I've read a few, but not as many as usual. And it's like, it's because I'm so distracted. It's not even physically being distracted. It's my attention span is fragmented. And I'm really pissed off about that, actually. I want it back. I want my attention span back. So I'm the same. I don't have anything on my phone now. And I try to just give myself permission to sit down and read a novel for an hour and stay focused and not think, I'm going to go just check my email now halfway through this chapter. Anyway.
Yeah. One thing that we briefly spoke about before we jumped online here was, so I think some of the negativity that it's in the world full stop, but in our industry as well, really comes through in the worst way in social media. And I've been really happy to step back from that and realize that I don't need to engage. There's no compulsion to have to prove someone wrong if they say something that's contrary to what I believe, because it really is, in many respects, a pretty wasted exercise.
Yeah, there are a lot of people out there, and they don't all, they're never going to agree. So I agree.
Yeah. So have you got anything big planned in the next little while, Lara?
Well,
any new books or anything coming out?
No, well, so my book is self-published, and in part, it's actually with Macmillan in Australia, New Zealand, which is great, but in the rest of the world, it's self-published, and I've decided to pay for, which is not cheap, a Spanish translation of my book.
See.
So I'm interacting with a lot of Latina, because I speak a bit of Spanish myself, so when I am on social media, I'm trying to speak some Spanish, interact with some of the South American accounts. And I may, once the book is out, I may actually travel to Mexico City and South America next year and try a little speaking engagement in Spanish. But I think I need to work on my pronunciation. But yeah, that's my next project. Because
it's so cool.
This is the for the people thing we were talking about, right? Like, there's a lot of Spanish speaking women out there need help. Yeah.
Some of my friends in South America have mentioned the same thing to me, not in the women's health market, but just in terms of general health and nutrition education, because most of it is published in English. Probably the next biggest is German, and there's very little published in Spanish, although there is more now. Not as much filters through to the mainstream, and so I think it's a really important thing. And I've actually toyed with that idea before as well. I lived in Buenos Aires for just a little while. And I would love to go back, but I haven't had the courage yet to go back and try and do a speaking engagement. I think I really need to practice.
Yeah, well, I need to practice too. And the other challenge for a Spanish book for the Latino market is that apparently they don't order from Amazon. They don't, or, I don't know how I'm going to get the books to them. This is part of the problem. I'm probably going to have to bite the bullet and actually pay for some runs of print the book in Mexico, print the book in Argentina. So at this stage, it's a labor of love. I don't know if I'm going to make any money whatsoever from the Spanish book, but we'll see.
I may, I'll offline, I'll connect and maybe connect you with someone I know who's done that. My good friend, Dr. Ian Brooks, was New Zealand's biggest selling business author for a long time. He's actually a Canadian guy as well.
Okay.
And he became, I think, was very well read in South America, both throughout South America and also in Brazil. So I don't know exactly how he did it, because he was also a self-published author, but he was one of those real success stories in self-publishing back in the sort of 80s.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Good.
Awesome, Lara. Yes. So you're one of our featured speakers at HPN this year, along with, we have a stacked lineup. It's yourself, obviously, and I'm super looking forward to listening to you, but also Julia Ruckledge, the mental health expert, Professor Mike Hutchison, Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Mickey Willardon, Kirsten Bainon, myself. It's going to be a pretty awesome day.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I am so stoked that you're going to be there. I think the work you're doing is amazing. And so thank you so much for being on today. I'll have the show notes up, and we'll have the podcast out probably in the next week. And we'll make sure to link to your book in there. And like I say, we will just keep following you and all the amazing work you're doing in women's health.
Great. I really enjoyed our conversation. I will definitely, share the podcast so more people can listen in. And I'll see you next month.
Very soon.
Yeah, 6 weeks away. Something like that.
Awesome, Lara. Thanks so much.
Yeah, take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.